Good evening. Hope you all are doing well. You're probably wondering why I am making this video, and also as to why the campaign creation VODs have been a bit delayed in being uploaded here. The reason is because, as you know, the first two campaign creation VODs were muted because of issues with soundtrack by Twitch, and so because of that, I thought it would only be fair to basically go through what was covered in those streams and essentially just summarize the conversations that were had, the contributions people made, and just overall what was developed in those streams in a shorter format so that you don't have to, try and piece it together from context clues. So yeah, that's what we'll be covering today. Now, to give a bit of an explanation as to, firstly, I guess, why I even made the campaign creation stream, it was essentially more of it was a mixture of just a way of interacting with chat more to enjoy the creative minds of the community that I have, as well as just generally trying to help people who are potentially new to DMing get a bit of an insight as to how one would build a campaign if they were inclined to. And so that was kind of the general purpose. And as someone who has done a lot of campaign design for quite a reasonable amount of time, I thought it was only appropriate that I share kind of my own creative insight with it. And of course, spend those times on stream also, chatting with the viewers if they ask for advice, happily lending them a hand with it. I think you'll see that in some of the more recent VODs, which should be coming out hopefully in a couple of days. But for now, let's just go through what was covered in those two. So we'll start with the details of things such as the villain and the general power structures. Then we'll move to the map, which you've got a nice little preview of here, and then the more specific details of the towns themselves. So normally when I make campaigns, I don't normally start with the villain first. I normally make the world first and then fit the villain in based on the worlds I create. But in this case, I decided actually to start with the villain first and frame the world around it, which seemed more appropriate for such an endeavor. So that's what we did. Let me give you some nice music in the background while we continue to discuss this further. But yes, so starting off with the villain, I knew originally I wanted it to be some kind of idea of essentially some sort of stronger creature possessing someone a bit more simplified, if that makes sense. So in this case, we have Zrag the Boar, also known as Paul, who is a hobgoblin rogue mastermind. The reason why I kind of picked that was because, one, rogue masterminds already work for a great kind of more down-to-earth human villain that is more reliant on connections rather than just raw magic power. And of course, the motivation is that they have been possessed or entranced by an aboleth's soul trapped inside a boulder, which we, of course, named the Hungiro, courtesy of Bobicus in chat, who came up with not just the villain concept, but also that name. So yes, the main goal of it, of course, aboleths tend to want to try and basically depose the gods, because they used to be the quote-unquote gods of the world until the gods basically muscled in on their turf and made it so that they could no longer maintain influence over the people. So this aboleth, because it's just the soul trapped inside a boulder, they're trying to reanimate with a magically infused mech body, and then transfer its soul into it. Then once it's merged, they will essentially start enslaving nearby villagers, in order to basically try and start almost like a reverse crusade against the temples, in order to weaken the influence of the deities and make them more vulnerable to, well, essentially death. And of course, we prepared one small instance of if the party somehow manages to like sabotage or destroy the mech body, what does the aboleth do? In that case, we said if it does, then it will basically possess Zrag, merge its soul in with Zrag, and use the networks to start basically taking over the kingdom, inciting war, and just slowly building towards that goal further on. And then finally the weakness, which is just basically the perfectionism, essentially. It's just perfectionism. They're too obsessed with the design of the new body, and so they keep wanting new features for the minions to add, and making all these small changes and everything that it doesn't really need to, and that delays the actual like reanimation, essentially. So yes, that was all courtesy of Bobbicus and Enforcer Hound 1 for their inputs into the design of this villain. So I was quite happy with it. I thought it was quite nice because, again, I just started with like the very generalized concept and they gave me the specifics, so it worked out well. Then of course we moved on to the map, which at the time didn't have all these names. These were recently added when I transferred this all into Roll20. This is probably one where it's probably easier to go look back at the stream and see my method of making the actual continents themselves, but essentially the overall shapes just kind of slowly developed as time went on. Like there was discussions about how would the landscape shift, what kind of edge effects would we be expecting. There was potential discussion of this like sandy atoll over here that you can see and how that would work. And then of course this kind of lagoon archipelago centered around this large volcano, which again, like Bobbicus gave the input of, that fertile soil is more common around a volcano, and so that would be kind of where the main kind of food supply for whatever empire was here would be collected from. So again, thank you for that, Bobbicus. But yeah, so I guess we'll just go quickly through kind of, I guess, the overall landscape of each of them. So we've got one empire, which is Strateris. So these are just kind of the general power structures. So we have Strateris, which I was originally referred to as the Neapolitan. I recently changed it to be the Divided Nations as a joke on the United Nations, which is basically the continent of beginning. So it had the original empire under a ruler, which I haven't named yet. And then the internal conflicts and other major events basically led to the downfall and led to the spread of people to the other islands, essentially. And the way it's kind of structured is that there were kind of like three major families that ruled, and they split apart and essentially set up their own cities across the continent, but still maintained, trade routes and relations, because that was going to be the only way that people survived. Then we have Fronard, which is referred to as the Holy Atoll. It's a smaller religious sanctuary that's very accepting of any non-evil deities, and in the history books it's founded 50 years after the colonization of this final empire, Colonidri. So it's the newest one out of the three. And then Coronidri is simply the world's wreath, which is a lagoon nation founded 200 years after the dissolve of the empire. So essentially there was just kind of smaller settlements here first, and then they eventually developed into something larger in nature. So yes, all that kind of stuff was just mainly me coming up with it and getting small bits of input from Bobbicus and Enforcer Hound, but again, their kind of input and contributions were quite valuable, so thank you for that. I guess then we'll move into the towns and civics, which was primarily focused on the capital cities and the larger towns. We haven't actually gotten to the villages just yet, but we will get to them eventually. But yes, so if we start with Strateris, we have our three capital cities, as you can see, Iltuno, Bessarind, and Riverton. Each one I decided would be good to be named after basically named after the family. So you can see like Iltuno is named after the Iltoli family. Riverton's named after the Riverdown family, and Baserind is named after the Beso-Hon family. And yes, each city's pretty big, about 15,000 to 20,000 each. Primarily human in most, but has a lot of other civilized races in it. That's normally how I like to run things, is like you'll usually have like a predominantly human empire in most situations. For the case of Il Tuno, because it is one of the main desert towns, it's situated in an inland oasis. All the residents are kind of built partially underground, essentially to prevent the desert heat from sinking too far in and like kind of baking the walls to make it really hot. The Otolia family, I decided, one, it would be good to go with Loxodons because, Loxodons are definitely a more unique kind of take on a ruler, and instead of being evil, because let's be honest, not many Loxodons are evil unless something bad has happened to them, we decided that they were essentially trying to search for alternative methods of sourcing sustenance for the townsfolk due to the fact that, they don't have arable land near them. They're basically relying on trade imports to keep themselves alive. And then, of course, just a little bit of lore regarding a symbol of a footprint carved into the roads as a form of blessing to a goddess of travel. It's always just kind of these nice little flavor touches that I add to the towns to essentially make them feel a bit more personalized. Granted, this is also thanks to the help of the Donjon generators, which, if you haven't used those, I'd highly recommend. They're really good. Oh, and for reference, the map was made in HexTML. I know Bobik has suggested using Asgar to map it all, but I hadn't used it before and it was way too complicated, so I passed up on that. But yes, then we have Riverton, which is basically in charge of this massive wheat field you can see surrounding it. So they're situated on the south coast. This is Riverton. I was reading the wrong section. Yeah, Riverton governs the largest area of wheat fields, hosts an influential agricultural guild, which is going to be important. The Riverdown family, I kind of had it that they were descended from the original king, and so they have this idea that, the land is theirs to rule by birthright, the other families have no say, essentially. That sort of thing, which is good for provoking some kind of hostility amongst the families that can drive potential story elements. With Baserind, which is this nice port town here, we have it's primarily elf due to the fact that there is a strong human elf and half elf, so they have a more elven lineage, high elf to be specific, that are trying to introduce trade tariffs in order to pressure the other ruling families, because Baserind essentially controls all the import and export because they are the primary port town for the entire continent. The only other place they could do it is on these two villages above Riverton, and even then they wouldn't have the infrastructure to support it. So they are in a very good position. They also house a thieves district where it's essentially the black market. And yeah, it boasts a large dock area for imports and exports. Then for the larger towns, we have two. We have Navisura and we have Equilentum. Both of which were heavily assisted by Lord Mobro, a regular viewer of mine, who basically suggested the basic premises of the two towns. So we've got Navisura, which is one of the larger trade towns. The city streets, because it's in the desert, they're covered by tall awnings made from animal hides to kind of protect the mounts and the cart horses from the heat and wind. And so because of the way that these kind of awnings cover the city, the city has the nickname of the docked vessel because it basically looks like a stranded ship in the middle of the desert. And then it acts as a central hub for another plot device referred to as the Silvered Palm, which is a grifter's guild that can make items disappear by essentially modifying them and reselling them on the black market. And then of course Equilentum, which is situated on the edge of these wheat fields, is more related to agriculture. So they have a large array of stables, they have animal handlers. They're the people you go to if you're looking for good cart horses or potentially even good hunting companions. and yeah, it's again just a large trade settlement that the adventurers can go to, mainly of course if they're looking for like livestock or potential mounts if they're looking to travel more. But yes, so that's kind of the general layout. Oh, before I forget, also the name of the mare, Estefina Riverdown, that was a suggestion by Steph Things, which was quite a lovely name. I do appreciate that suggestion quite a bit, because honestly, naming things is hard, let's be honest. Yes, on to Fronard, which is our religious settlement. Not many things to name there. So we had Astronym, which is more of my personal favorite city to name, or to come up with, which was basically a mixed dwarf and human, very highly religious group, hence why the dwarves are there. Boat's an ancient spire to Celestian, who is the god of, I think, like travel and a few other things, and is accessible via a sandy channel at low tide. I'm thinking that will probably be a situation of like how the tides are kind of set up, then it takes like very specific tides for the sandy channel to come up. It might become more of a rarer thing to have access. So it's governed by the High Priest of Cuthbert, who is a protector Asimar, and his whole goal is essentially he wants to create a safe haven for all acolytes of good aligned religions. Essentially just making it so that, you don't have to be persecuted for your religion, is his belief. And of course it's very renowned for its intricately carved stone towers that almost kind of dot the outer perimeter, kind of as like a nice architectural feature. And then of course we have Slanton, which is this small town on the other side of the mountain, so it's quite a bit of a journey to get there. Because it's right next to the mountains, it's actually built into a rocky outcrop, so it's kind of slanted, hence the name Slanton. But yes, it's this is where a lot of the contributions from Mobro and Steph really kicked into high gear, because first off, the person that governs this place, and I kid you not, this is actually what was suggested and put in the final version. A fire genasi named Ash Mustache originally was going to be called Ash Mustar as a reference to Ash Ketchum, and then I randomly said, this kind of sounds like instead of hearing Mustar, I was like, this kind of sounds like you're saying mustache, and so it stuck. And then that just kind of developed the entire character. So we made it that they were secretly worshipping the Queen of Air and Darkness, which is a very evil Fey deity, and the only reason he's serving her is because he was promised a permanent illusory mustache that will rival all others and make his family jealous. It's kind of a little ridiculous, but it was a great idea by Mobro to do that. And then of course the final part, which is the exotic food culture, especially specializing in seafood and small game. That was a suggestion by Steph, which then Mobro leaned in on it and gave the idea of someone claiming to sell a legendary dish that increases your lifespan every time you eat it, which I thought was very Toriko themed, but I liked the idea. So that stuck. And then finally, we get to Coronidri, the lagoon city, which I forgot to mention the name of, like, the nickname for it is the Wreath's Crown, which is mainly because it kind of looks like the spikes of a crown from a top-down view. So we have Cryanerd, which is the capital city. It's actually much larger than the others. It's 45,000 people, so it's absolutely enormous and dwarven in nature. This is again kind of where Mobro and Steph really shone through, mainly Mobro in this case, with the idea of this character Grill Buff Engrin, who is essentially the champion of Moradin, and so everything's kind of centered around his essentially his sacrifice. So you have like the military generals that are known as the Circle of Engrin. There's a summer festival called the Day of Knight's Grace that's in honor of Engrin, and a very interesting plot point that was brought up actually by Mobro, apart from the slime takeover encounter, which was on par because, you know, he is a slime mage. And so he gave the idea that the capital, because they're right next to the volcano, which is lovingly named Mount Laveru, thank you for that, Steph, that the capital is essentially trying to turn the Torment volcano into a legendary forge of Moreton to try and recreate Engren's hammer, which is considered like an artifact or a legendary weapon called Engren's Might. And I thought, this is a good idea to start. But what if we had it that, you know, because even within religions you can get conflict. So what about if we made it that the church, you know, the Church of Moreton essentially created a division about how to return the hammer to its rightful place. Like, you know, can it be reforged and remade in Mount Laveru? Some people claiming yes, other people are claiming no, and that it has to actually be retrieved from the bottom of the ocean where it lies. So again, just a good plot point for an internal conflict that the adventurers can play off. And so from there, with a solid capital city in mind, we then had two last towns left to do, which is Granaphon, which is in charge of maintaining the food supply for the rest of the empire, and Doromura, which is essentially the more central, like, gate town, so to speak. Which wrong tab. So this was again also kind of where Mobro's talent shined in, because he suggested using turtles, because I was like, it would be interesting to have some unique race there, and he suggested turtles because of the fact that they are very good with agriculture and are more accepting of other races. So I thought, why not? We'll go with turtles, and having it kind of basically going through a harsh famine due to these kind of elemental influences coming from Mount Laveru, because I kind of had it that it would be interesting for Mount Laveru to also be kind of secretly a planar portal to the elemental plane of fire, and so that kind of planar essence would essentially be leaking through and affecting the surrounding landscapes and making it harder for them to grow crops and live there. And yeah, essentially, and yeah, it's a good little town. And even though Mobro did also point out that turtles got done dirty because they only live for 50 years, even though I would have thought they missed a 0 on that. So always good to keep that in mind. And finally, the infamous Doromura, which was a really fun one to come up with, because it's a mixed dwarf Triton town, and the Tritons, of course, live at the bottom of the ocean. So I was like, if they're living in a lagoon, it would make sense that they would need some sort of like navy or aquatic support, and the Tritons can do that. Like, I didn't want to rely on sea elves. Like, that's because that then leads into secure gain, and then you've got other, like, you know, lore-related issues you then have to deal with there. So I was like, let's just go with the Tritons, because they're less involved in that. And so yeah, it's got you know, a large fortification that controls the main naval passage into the Crown Lagoon, and the actual Senate is made up of a representation of Triton and sea elves, not just dwarves. And then of course the residences, and this is again suggested by Mobro, they have like a spiral-like pattern carved into their doors, representative of the ocean's power to destroy, and the shells strong enough to endure their force, which I thought was a very lovely symbolic thing to go with. Like, it was a very good pick to make. And so yeah, it was also funny because I think I remember him trying to clip this, and then it got muted, but he essentially made the joke of Doromura kind of sounding like a dwarf muttering a slur under their breath, just being like, Doromura. So we had a good chuckle at that. But yeah, that's essentially what we got up to in terms of the streams, or in terms of like what progress we actually did. We did actually go into factions, but again, you'll see those in the new VODs they'll be released soon after this goes live. But in the meantime, the last thing we'll finish up on is some stories that were mentioned during the stream that, of course, were somewhat discussed in the chat, but again, it would be a one-sided conversation if you looked through it. So instead, I am going to bring us back to the bar, and I will tell like a rough summary of what those stories involved. So again, in this case, let's start with the first one, which was with Bobicus, the one who suggested who assisted the most with the villain. We were mainly talking about Dragon Heist stories, and he was talking about how when he was running Dragon Heist, the party developed a vendetta against Jarl Axel's men, and so because of that, it basically ended the campaign because you couldn't continue further. And it was very much a discussion of, the power of the power of having to adapt to what the party's actions are. And I kind of, this again, I shared a story from when I ran Dragon Heist once as kind of an introductory section into a homebrew campaign, which was the first mission when you're trying to find Rhinar. The book only tells you about what happens if they go into the streets, what happens if they go to the dock ward and that sort of thing. But they don't talk about what if the party decides to, go to his estate in the nobles ward and look there. And so of course I had to improvise that. It didn't go too well. Two of them attempted to break in and then ended up getting arrested by the town guard. It was not great. It was not a good time for them. But that was one interesting story to kind of bring up the notion of, you shouldn't be, not everything you write down is going to accommodate for every situation. As much as I always try to, that's not how it works. You have to have a good level of improvisational skills as a DM, and to be able to kind of adapt to what is going on at all times. And then of course, that same stream, so this is the first one we're talking about, Enforcer Hound also actually asked for some advice because he was creating his first solo board, which is always a hard endeavor the very first time you do it, but I appreciated that he was determined enough to see it through. And so he basically went through this idea of essentially having it that the gods basically go through a 10,000 year not process. I probably worded it slightly wrong, but essentially it was that every 10,000 years, the gods have to basically reincarnate into another person's body in order to survive it, which is kind of very, Lucifer-esque, but a very interesting idea nonetheless. That's a lot of potential for, divine sparks to suddenly become more available to the mortal plane than ever before. And we had kind of a brief discussion of where that could go. And then we got on to his discussion about some of the empires he was running, and because he had 4 empires and each one had its own kind of like side story. And one of the ones he was talking about was essentially a queen of a city and her advisor, who was a death cleric. I think it was meant to be that it was secretly a death cleric and that she didn't know, but they were essentially being like, I want the advisor to somehow betray the queen, but the problem is, one, I'm worried about whether the party is I don't want to railroad them into essentially assisting the queen and the crown, and also I don't know how to make it subtle that the advisor is kind of preparing to betray the queen. And so I kind of spoke to him about it and said, well, firstly, don't railroad, that's going to be really terrible. What you could do is give them the offer first. If they do take the offer, then have it that they have to kind of almost work their way through the system in order to first run into the advisor, and that's where things can start to kind of escalate from there and drive a plot. But if they don't take it, then have them do, random missions, working for factions, working for other proprietors, that sort of thing. Have them build up a reputation that attracts the interests of the crown. And then once they have that interest, have the advisor come to them. and that can be another launching point, which he agreed was, you know, quite palpable as a situation to kind of handle the two outcomes of that decision. And then of course the discussion kind of focused more towards how do you then make that kind of power dynamic subtle. And I suggested to him the idea that essentially, because he also mentioned that the reason the queen would be a prime target is because, one, the crown itself that she wears has like a level of like fortune telling nature to it, so it's able to see into the future, but also that she's pregnant. And that's when I mentioned, okay, well, are you making it something that should be kept secret? Because the thing that I remember the most when reading through like stories of queens and how they were deposed is that they normally tended to hide their pregnancy because people were always concerned about, you know, if they bore a son or a daughter, then their lineage would still continue and they wouldn't be able to have a right to the throne. It's similar to what happens in Macbeth. It's similar to what happens with Kronos. If you know the origin story of the Greek gods, it's that similar premise. And so I said to him, well, you should probably keep it secret because again, it paints her as a target more than just the crown. But then this is where it can get interesting. What you could do is you could have this death cleric advisor essentially start with a position of power below the queen, and then through finding out her weaknesses and kind of almost playing the system and playing on the emotions of the queen, almost essentially perform like a reversal of power in that dynamic, to the point where the advisor has more control over the queen than the queen has control over herself, essentially. And that was again a very interesting idea that he thought could be palpable, but said needed time to think on it, which I said was perfectly fine, because at the end of the day, my word's not law, it's just a suggestion, and you can take it or leave it. I do not force that sort of thing on people. That's not how I work. But yes, and then finally we had a nice discussion with Brom, the Nat 1 digital artist, who came in about the end of the first stream, and him and I had a very lovely discussion about a few things. Firstly, ideas such as how you run exploration and survival, mainly with dealing with how do you actually pressure the characters into remembering to bring food and water, like how do you run dying of thirst, perhaps. So we kind of discussed that further, and then we got into the inevitable discussion of, you know, taking a hiatus from D&D, because I mentioned that I had been on a 2-year hiatus essentially from playing and DMing because of circumstances. And him and I kind of basically had a discussion about it and said, you know, how do you look at the positives of you know, going on hiatus or of a group disbanding, because at the time I felt terrible about you know, groups disbanding, and because of it kind of had a lot of issues with like you know, trust and confidence in my own skills. And he brought up this notion that, you know, essentially helped rationalize how when a D&D group disbands, you don't have to stick with everyone. You pick and choose who you keep, and remember that at the end of the day, the people who will give you the most genuine opinion are those that are your true friends. They'll tell you if you're doing terrible, and most of the time they will be supportive and able to, you know, help you work on your skills. Like definitely with my friend group, I feel that a lot. I mean, heck, I've been trying to learn Dota 2 with one of my friends, and he's had to put up with some of my stupid decisions and nonsense. But even he is saying that I am getting better, and that always makes me happy, because you know, I shouldn't have to, you know, force it upon him to you know, for me to just consistently stay bad. I should improve for both his sake and for my own, so I can, you know, refine my skills better. But yes, we had that kind of discussion, and I basically went through the horror story regarding Phoenix, which I've mentioned I've mentioned before in VODs, I'm not going to go over it because I feel like it's very petty to tell the story over and over again. So it will just be more of a thing of if you want to know the story, I don't mind retelling it on stream, but I will probably do it in a summarized form because, you know, I don't want to be playing it like a broken record essentially. But yeah, so that's the basic summary of all of those 2 VODs. I hope this helps to, I guess, you know, condense it down into something a lot more palatable, gives a bit more perspective on what the creation streams are doing going forward, and yes, I just hope that this has helped to kind of digest those muted VODs and not make it, you know, too much of a detective mystery trying to figure out what I'm talking about, what I'm doing. And yeah, if you do enjoy like you know what I've covered and what the future VODs have covered, do feel free to pop by on my stream. Like, you know, you could contribute your ideas, you can ask me for advice, you can run your own ideas past me, and I will give my honest opinion in order to assist. I mean, heck, literally last stream we helped basically evaluate a character persona from a new viewer. We spent a good amount of time going through it, and at the end of the day, they actually said that they got quite a bit of insight from it, and so I was quite happy to see that. Granted, they didn't agree with everything I said, but again, they acknowledged that, you know, opinion is opinion, and it's very subjective. There's no objective opinions. Like, that's just how it is nowadays. But yeah, with that, thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this and you enjoy a lot of the stuff I do in my VODs, then please do subscribe and you know, potentially come follow me on Twitch if you want to see the content fresh out the barrel, so to speak. And yeah, with that, thank you for coming. And have a wonderful evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are. Adios.